Good morning, afternoon, evening, my fellow dummies. This is Geopolitics. Welcome to today's video, a dummy's guide to geopolitics. To begin with, what the hell does geopolitics actually mean? Most would assume that geopolitics is the combination of geographic studies with that of political studies. This is perhaps the best way to understand the subject. Geo, after all, means Earth, so geopolitics simply means Earth politics. But what does the study and practice of geopolitics actually entail? First and foremost, it involves the study of geography. As an academic field itself, geography encompasses a wide variety of subjects. The study of the physical features of our planet is perhaps what geography is mostly known for. However, there is also human geography that focuses on how populations interact with their environment and, ultimately, how people affect and are affected by the environment they find themselves in. Politics, very much like geography, is also an extremely diverse field. It can be summed up as the study of governance and power and how populations organize themselves locally, nationally, and internationally, and usually encompasses a wide spectrum of theories and ideologies to explain how society functions and how it should function. When both the physical and human element of geography combines with how humans organize and govern themselves, geopolitics is the result. In other words, geopolitics attempts to explain how nations interact with one another according to their geography, and how the physical environments nations find themselves in affect what decisions nations should or could make on the world stage. Geopolitics is more often than not interlinked and synonymous with international relations, and you will likely see the two subjects blurring into one another. To that end, geopolitics explains how the many nation-states interact with one another according to their geographic reality. Whereas international relations, although being an umbrella term for anything international, focuses on the interactions of nation-states in the context of their political, economic, and even cultural relationships, while also offering certain assumptions and theories on how states behave on the international stage, making international relations far more theoretical than geopolitics. Furthermore, geopolitics can also explain how things work within nations. After all, one must have an understanding of the geography of a nation in order to work out where its resources and population centers are, how much sea it officially has dominion over, and of course, bordering nations, as well as understanding which regions are most strategic, militarily and economically. Now for a little historical background. Geopolitics was coined by the Swede Rudolf Kjellén during the late 19th century, and as a subject of interest, geopolitics boomed throughout the early to mid-20th century. This period of time was almost wholly dominated by Europe, the United States, and Japan, with the Europeans in particular dominating most of the planet. Geopolitics would end up being related to a multitude of issues, primarily those of international relations relating to warfare, control over trade and resources, and of course, expansion. Prior to geopolitics being coined as a term, schools of thought around political geography already existed. In fact, some of the most important works were made before geopolitics was coined, such as Alfred Mayen's focus on sea power that would influence the United States until today, or much of Friedrich Ratzel's works that would end up inspiring the Nazi project of Lebensraum. Today, some of the subjects and topics that were tied to geopolitics are discarded and shunned due to past relations with imperialism and even Nazism, most notably geographic and historical determinism and the German Geopolitik. As you can imagine, geopolitics was vital, to say the least, throughout the 20th century, as it determined how nations would interact with others and how said nations view the world as a whole. Since most of the planet was dominated by a handful of European powers, much of the globe would be directly influenced by the geopolitical understanding of these nations. In Europe alone, many different concepts of thought on geopolitics came about. The British, German, and French schools of thought are perhaps the most important of all, due to how said schools influenced their nations' global empires and later the world wars. These nations would produce great works from Alfred Mackinder, Friedrich Ratzel, and Paul Vidal de la Blache. Of course, one cannot forget the American theorists that would also play a big part in the development of geopolitics, especially Alfred Mayen, as previously mentioned, who developed the idea of sea power. In the latter half of the 20th century, geopolitics was somewhat revived. We would see the influence of Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Their ideas basically determined how the world's new hegemon would behave internationally for decades. The idea of geography impacting politics, especially in the realm of international relations, can be traced further back in time, as most civilized kingdoms and empires understood the importance of geography in their ambition to expand and defend their interests. The Chinese, for example, have had a very robust take on geopolitics. Over 2,000 years ago, the likes of Sun Tzu and Guanzhong would influence how China would develop. Such figures advised their empires and kingdoms how to maneuver, defend, and find victory over their enemies, not just on the battlefield, but also in policy. The ancient Greeks also had a great understanding of geopolitics, and we are given some of the earliest examples of this in the Peloponnesian War. We get to see how Athens and Sparta compete on land and at sea, and where they focus their efforts according to their geographic interests. Furthermore, throughout European history, geostrategists would develop and act out the ideas that would later feed into the contemporary understanding of geopolitics. Today, geopolitics has been swallowed up and overtaken somewhat by international relations theory. The reason behind this is partially due to the influence that geopolitics had during the World Wars. Germany, notably with its branch of Geopolitics, was seen as too aggressive and barbaric, not to mention that the Europeans, Americans, and Japanese used geopolitical reasoning to expand and keep their empires. So the subject itself, as well as many branches of geopolitics, slowly lost favor in academia. A good example of this would be realism, founded by Hans Morgenthau, who called geopolitics a pseudoscience. Even the idealism of Woodrow Wilson, which has developed further into democratic peace theory, neglects geopolitics. Those who did adhere to geopolitics, such as Henry Kissinger, who adopted the German Geopolitik and adapted it to the United States of America, is seen by many as a war criminal. This, however, doesn't mean that geopolitics is no longer important. Of course it is. It is something that is obviously still understood and viewed as a vital subject in today's international relations. It's simply no longer at the forefront of international politics in academia, while it is still the basis of how nations view the world in practice for the most part. To understand what geopolitical issues may look like, we'll briefly analyze three separate problems. The first issue is one that is historic. How could Germany compete with a much larger Russia and the United Kingdom that controlled the seas? German politicians, generals, and theorists struggled with this question since Bismarck unified Germany. Germany was locked in the very heart of Europe, surrounded by massive empires to both their west and east, as well as being blocked out of the oceans by the vast British naval empire. This made the German situation less than ideal. Theorists therefore came up with some solutions that could potentially take Germany out of this problematic reality. One idea, developed by Ratzel himself, was Lebensraum, the conquest of the East to expand German living space and population, essentially making Germany the new Russia. The Germans knew they had to also be wary of France, a rather large empire right next to them, and of course the naval superpower that was Britannia. To counter the United Kingdom, a strong navy was needed, but could the Germans be able to produce such a large navy? Perhaps. If they could subdue France, it could be possible, as they would have access to the Atlantic. But if France was not completely overrun by the Hun, simply weakening France to such a degree that they no longer pose a threat to the Großdeutsches Reich would suffice. This geopolitical thought that revolved around the German people's expansion at the cost of all those around them is one of the major reasons why Germany was so ecstatic about World War I, and why, in my humble opinion, the Germans would eventually trigger a world war if the Austro-Hungarians hadn't done it for them. German offensives against France, Belgium and Russia were extremely brutal, as Germany planned to annihilate both their rivals before their rivals could eventually overwhelm Germany, who was in a less favourable geographic position. After all, the Germans themselves had partaken in the destruction of another power that was sandwiched between empires, Poland. Of course, as we all know, it didn't work out for the Germans. This regrettably would lead to the rise of the Nazis, a last desperate attempt at expanding Germany that led to another, somehow worse, world war. The second issue is one of the modern day, China and the South China Sea. China's been tearing its way back into the global spotlight since Deng Xiaoping had the revolutionary idea of opening up the nation to trade. Since then, China has done nothing but win time after time, and an economic miracle has occurred. However, with all that money and all that influence, China is still in a very precarious situation because it's at risk of having its rivals dominated at sea. The Chinese rely on the sea to such an extent that if they were to lose control of their maritime regions, their enemies could starve China of 60% of its trade. The South China Sea alone is responsible for around 40% of said trade. In other words, $5.3 trillion worth of goods are transported through the South China Sea on a yearly basis. Moreover, around 80% of its energy imports go through here. The result of this would be beyond catastrophic for China, as its major strength, that is mass industry, would quite literally perish. This in turn would weaken the nation economically in such a way it would be set back decades. What's the solution? The build-up of many tiny islands to expand China's exclusive economic zone and claiming real islands everywhere. These rather pathetic attempts at claiming seawater are now backed by the largest naval force on the planet. However, keep in mind the Chinese Navy is not capable of doing what the United States can. It's a mostly defensive navy, unlike the Americans, who have a navy built for force projection. Mahan's sea power idea is really stuck. If China loses control over its coasts and seas, it will have no choice but to bend to the will of the nation that does. The final issue is one of the near future: access to water, or better yet, lack thereof, in India. India has always been a land with great economic potential. However, India has found itself being outplayed by its neighbour, China, far too many times. The last straw, I believe, will occur once China begins to control waterways in Tibet that feed many of India's, and indeed much of South and Southeast Asia's, major rivers. If India loses control over its water from Tibet, India will be a very thirsty country indeed. This major power play by China could potentially make India its puppet or trigger another world war. Either way, it will be one hell of a problem to resolve in the future. So what's the solution? India will most likely attempt to form a coalition of friendly nations in Southeast Asia and elsewhere against China in order to pressure China in such a way that they are forced to play nice. Whatever India chooses to do, it better start soon, because the Chinese are all but ready to once more take their place at the center of the world. The Middle Kingdom rises to the top of the food chain, and it aims to stay there for quite a while. And on that cheery note, this is all for today. I do hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, share and subscribe, and of course comment on what you think are interesting geopolitical issues of today or the near future. Debate in the comments and have fun. See you next time.